Continuing. Tonight, I'm happy to, we have two speakers, and I'm happy to give you a little bit of background first, except for the fact that this thing seems to have stopped. Can I get some technical assistance? Apparently not for me. There we go. Okay. Oh, thank you very much. Hidden Jamaica Plain is a group of volunteers. I will be talking a little bit about who we are quickly, and giving a little bit also about the background of slavery in Boston and in Jamaica Plain. Then Natalie Eldridge will be discussing Sarah Winslow Deming's journal, which chronicles her April 1775 escape from British-occupied Boston throughout Jamaica Plain. Before we do that, I would like to mention that we have this journal printed in its entirety, not the entire journal, but the escape part. It's online on the Jamaica Plain Historical Society's website. I also have about 20 of the printouts in the back, as well as a general explanation with a link where you can get to the links to the original, which is at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and to the Jamaica Plain, the Hidden JP annotation. In discussing the Sarah Winslow Deming journal, we found that there was somebody who was mentioned several times, and we wanted to find out who she was, this woman named Lucinda. And Emily Curran has done a tremendous job with the research. She found out that Lucinda was a woman who was enslaved by Sarah and John Deming, who accompanied Sarah on their flight. The goals of Hidden Jamaica Plain are several-fold, and we also have flyers in the back that will tell you more, and I encourage you to pick one up at the end of the presentation. We want to understand the history of the indigenous people who lived here in reciprocity with the land we call JP, and how that land was stolen from them. We have done so far most of our work on enslaved people and enslavers from the 16 and mostly 1700s in Jamaica Plain, and started to develop a picture of the lives of enslaved people here. We intend to develop a history of abolitionism in Jamaica Plain, and to research movements in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries that have made an impact on our Jamaica Plain community and beyond. And of course, we'll be sharing that widely. Our members come from all the various institutions around JP, as well as community activists who are unaffiliated, the academic community, and we have two wonderful advisors in Crystal Rollins-Jackson and Byron Rushing. It's 100% volunteer effort, and I invite you to join us if you're interested. So what did we discover in Boston? The place we call Jamaica Plain was actually part of the homelands of the Massachusetts people. And the New England colonists who came adopted slavery and land theft as the primary economic drivers to build their colonies. Slave trading started in Massachusetts in 1638, and a lot of people do not know that Massachusetts was the first colony to legally sanction slavery in 1641. By the 1720s, 12% of Boston's population were enslaved, and in Boston households, that meant 1 in 4 enslaved someone. It was a little bit different model than we have seen in the South, because there were smaller numbers of people. Most enslaver households had only 1 or 2 enslaved people. We discovered in Jamaica Plain at least 27 people were enslaved here in the 1700s. We found that in the Roxbury 1771 tax records, nearly 11% of the population of Roxbury were owners of what were called euphemistically servants for life. In Jamaica Plain, many of the wealthy who had their Roxbury country estates surrounding the pond were enslavers. But enslavers include people who were farmers, widows, pretty much journeymen for printers and pretty much every walk of life included enslaved people. Some of the people who were enslavers were loyalists up to the revolution, like Joshua Loring of the Loring-Greenough House, the first inhabitant there. But the subsequent David Stoddard Greenough, the next owner, was a Revolutionary War patriot, and he was also an enslaver. And Pondside resident John Hancock of the famous Signature enslaved many people. Church founders of the first church down at the monument, across from the monument, included enslavers Eleazar Weld and John Morey and others. We also discovered that there were people indentured in the 1700s in Jamaica Plain. At least 7 people were indentured. And the indenture was another form of unfreedom, where people would sign away their lives, basically, until a certain point. Usually it was for boys, it was 21, and for girls, 18. And they could be treated in pretty much the same way as enslaved people were, but they did have an end in sight. We discovered at the Perkins estate over by the pond, the James Perkins, who was a slave trader, and that's how he made his money to build that house there. That it's no longer there, but those of you who are longer term Jamaica Plain residents may remember the house that was there, which was the 3rd version. He later, when the slave trade got cut off in the early 1800s, he and his brothers turned to opium smuggling into China, and that's where they made a ton of money. Successive families, as I mentioned, at Loring-Greenough, enslaved and indentured people, and so did first church people as well. One of the interesting things we found in our research was that the first church in Jamaica Plain death records from the early 1800s included families of free Black Americans. And we are currently writing up that story, and we'll be sharing that, we hope, within the next few months. So many people don't really know how slavery ended in Massachusetts. And the answer is from the efforts of enslaved people themselves. Enslaved people filed numerous petitions in the Massachusetts legislature. They filed lawsuits. And finally, in 1781, Elizabeth Freeman, and in 1783, Quock Walker won their court cases. And those 2 court cases are considered the turning point at which they established the legal basis for emancipation. However, be clear, this was not a day when people were ringing bells and saying, "You're free." What it meant was that enslaved individuals could now either leave and self-liberate, or they could sue their enslavers and have the law on their side. So I'd like to turn the floor over now to Natalie to talk about the journal.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many people here. It's exciting. I get to talk about, lucky me, Sarah Winslow Deming's journal from the Massachusetts Historical Society. And it's actually written in form of a letter, which she sent to her niece some couple months after she made this journey out of Boston. But she uses her journal, her day-by-day journal, and copies some of that. And so we have a very vivid description of what happens for her. The annotation that we did, if you go on the website, you'll see that one column of it has the letter in full without any interruption. And the other column is all the annotations we have put in to make the, to let you know about who the people are that she comes across and runs across, and the context for some of the events she talks about. And why is the journal so important? Well, there's several reasons. Many of the things that were written about the revolution were written by men, and they were often about movements of arms and and battles. This is a report about a woman who speaks very vividly about the emotional context of becoming a refugee, basically, from Boston, from her husband, at the beginning of the revolution. We also think that it conveys the uncertainty of the moment and also the value of journaling. And I wanted to say, if any of you have some journals or even letters from ancestors in your attic, you might think twice before getting rid of those. There might be a repository and some interesting information in them. So who was Sarah Winslow Deming? She was, actually, before I go there, I'm going to give you a little taste of the letter. This is early in the letter, the second paragraph. She's writing to her niece. She says, quote, "I was very unquiet from the moment I was informed that more troops were coming to Boston. 'Tis true that those who had wintered there had not given us much molestation, but an additional strength I dreaded and determined, if possible, to get out of their reach. Many a time have I thought that could I be out of Boston, together with my family and my friends, I could be content with the meanest fare and the slenderest accommodations. Out of Boston at almost any rate, away as far as possible from the infection of smallpox and the din of drums and martial music." Now, indeed, there was a smallpox epidemic at the time in Boston just starting up, and over the next few years, over 100,000 colonists, not just in Boston, but up and down the coast, died from this epidemic. So this is who she was. She was born in New Hampshire, where her mother was from, and lived there, and also in Boston, where her father was from. Oh, wait. Hold on. Okay. As an adult, okay, I have a different slide up. I see. She was the eldest of three. She had two younger brothers, John and Joshua. And as an adult, she married, and her husband was ill and died. And at age 30, she married John Deming, who she has been married to him 25 years at the time of the revolution. So it was a second marriage for both of them. Neither of them had children. They lived in the center of Boston, close to the Common, and also close to Old South Church, where her congregation worshiped. They were probably middle class. They were comfortable, not wealthy, and Sarah, like other women in her town, would take in boarders, usually girls, often relatives, whose parents paid to have them educated in Boston. Now, educated meant learning homemaking skills such as embroidery and sewing, making cloth, which the Patriots were doing to boycott the British cloth. And also they might learn some about dance and music and meet other youngsters in the city. So there were girls that came from the countryside to live with Sarah for a couple years, and learn these skills and meet these people, and also hear the sermons at Old South Meeting House, which were then widely discussed afterwards in the household. Okay. A couple of nieces of note. One is, she has the two brothers, John and Joshua. John has a daughter, firstborn of her generation, who he names after his older sister, Sarah. She is also Sarah Winslow. So this is the second Sarah Winslow in the talk. And this is the niece that she's writing the letter to. Now, we know that they had a very close relationship, in part because when she gets married to Sam Coverley, she arranges to have the marriage in Sarah Winslow Deming's bedchamber. She's very sick, and indeed she dies just 3 months after this wedding. So you know that they have a very close relationship. The other niece of note was Joshua's daughter, who was living with Joshua in Marshfield at the time. And she came and lived just a few years before the revolution, from 1770 to 72. And she was very proficient, learned a great deal about journaling, and she kept a very accurate journal about her life in the Deming household, which is where I got a lot of information about the people, the neighbors, the congregants, and the activities within the household, including information about Lucinda, which you'll hear about later. Another difficulty for Sarah Winslow Deming is that her son John was a patriot like she was, but not her son John, her brother John, and her brother Joshua was a loyalist and indeed worked for the king, worked for the crown in the military. Talking about Anna Green Winslow, this is a picture of her from her book, which was published by Alice Morse Earle in 1894, where I got a lot of information. So now let me share a little bit about what happened in the first shots of the revolution. By mid-April, there were at least 4,000 British troops and more than one soldier for every local male military of military age. So that was what the king required, I think. The British soldiers, also many of them brought their wives and their children with them to Boston. So there were a lot of British in Boston. We think the population at the time was around 15,000 Bostonians, local Bostonians. And Governor Gage was charged by he was the governor of all of North America for the king. And the king charged him to go to Boston to suppress the growing rebellion and enforce the coercive acts, which were to punish those who resisted. So I want to, I know the slide mentions that the Patriots were watching very carefully the troop movements. And I was very impressed by how much intelligence was going back and forth. So this is from Sarah's letter again. She talks about on Tuesday, April 18th, she was informed that the companies were moving. She was informed as it was happening, it appears, in the evening when it was dark before the moon was up. They were run through the town on tiptoes to go to the boats, getting ready to mobilize to go out to Concord and Lexington the next morning. And she says, quote, that whatever other business they might have, the main was to take possession of the bodies of Misters Adam and Hancock, whom they and we knew where they were lodged. And she also knew that expresses were sent forth both over the Neck and Charlestown Ferry to give our friends timely notice that they might escape. So even as Paul Revere and William Dawes were riding their horses, she was informed that they were out there to let their friends know. And then she goes on later and says, early on Wednesday, the fatal 19th April, before I had quitted my chamber, one after another came running up to tell me that the king's troops had fired upon and killed 8 of our neighbors at Lexington in their way to Concord. All the intelligence of this day was dreadful. So ordinary people, the everyday people in Boston, you really get a window. They didn't know what to do. Where was going to be safe? Is it safe to leave Boston? Would there be bloodshed in Boston? Or is it safer to stay in Boston where all the British soldiers are? It's like a garrison, it's got to be safe. So it was really hard to know. And many of her neighbors, she talks about, are encouraging her to stay in Boston, and others are getting ready to leave. Well, Sarah's been expressing her desire to leave Boston for probably months at this point. But her husband, John, did not want to leave. He was not willing to leave the home. And I think in part, she doesn't say this, but in part, he probably wants to protect the home and their belongings from it being pilfered, taken over by the British. But that first bloodshed in Lexington motivated him to begin looking for transport to get his wife out. So there were several challenges that they had. This, oh, maybe not. One of the challenges was finding a place, finding a conveyance, finding a way out. All the buggies and carts were busy, so were utilized. But he did finally come up with 2 small carriages. So with one, he carries Sarah out, and the other one, driven by a young teenage boy, a neighbor, Jeremy Church, with the 2 girls. And did I go over? Okay. So who's traveling with Sarah Winslow? She took what's called her 2 frighted girls, and Lucinda was one. You're going to hear more from Emily about that in just a few minutes. And she had been brought from Africa as a child and sold to the Demings, and had been living with them for some time. I think she's probably somewhere around 20, give or take a few years. She might be an older teen. She might be in her early 20s. And then they returned, John Deming and Jeremy Church returned. And where they went was to Jamaica Plain first. They went down the neck. You probably know that at that time, Boston, the only way out of Boston by land was the Boston Neck, which was basically going down Washington Street, I think. But it was so narrow, the neck was so narrow at high tide that you could barely get 2 carriages passing each other. You know, at low tide, there was a little more room. So the British had set up stations along the neck and were monitoring for some time the comings and goings, coming in and out of Boston. So Jamaica Plain is a small rural village 5 miles from Boston, and you've probably seen the 5-mile marker, which is still in Monument Square. It's a picture of that, which Mimi ran out and took yesterday. The mood in Jamaica Plain was, you know, widespread confusion. And they were, everybody did know about the Lexington and Concord battle. They knew that bloodshed had started and that there was going to be more. Many had already fled Boston, and it was hard to find conveyance. And who helped them was the Reverend of the church. And this picture is a picture of the first church that was built, a wooden church in 1769. The current church, which is a stone building, you know, at the monument, was built in 1853. So Reverend Gordon was the first minister of the church, which was called then the Third Parish of Roxbury, because Jamaica Plain was not a town, it was part of Roxbury. And Sarah refers to it as just the plains. We went to the plains. It's now the First Church of Jamaica Plain, which is a UU church, and there's several members in the audience, I think. He emigrated, Reverend Gordon emigrated from England at 43 because of his sympathy to the American liberty fight. He was really simpatico to that. He also gave a sermon on Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving before, that seemed to have angered the loyalists quite a bit. So he was concerned about that he might be the next target of the soldiers if they came down through land to Jamaica Plain. So he was busy getting stuff out of his house. But as she says, as again, from the letter directly, quote, when we came near opposite Mr. Gordon's house, he saw, knew, and sprung out to us. Where are ye going, my friends? I don't know, sir, was my answer, I believe. Mr. Deming said at the same time, to put this frighted woman, I remember he said that, into some house, I think Mr. Weld's. And Eliezer Weld had a big plot of land and a big house, and they knew him somewhat through the church because he worshiped at Old South when he was in Boston. And Gordon says, come in here, said he. All things are in common now. I have sent Mrs. Gordon to Dedham and am moving my goods as fast as I can. But we have beds enough for all of us tonight. And I wanted to share one other touching thing, if I can find it. I know
Let me make my apology.
Yes.
There should have been a map in these PowerPoints, but I ran out of time and did not get that done. But I'm going to pass out these across the road, so you have a sense of where the parsonage was. It refers to the Elliott School, but the Elliott School it is today did not exist, nor was Elliott Street cut through. It was on the other side of the triangle. And so take a look, orient yourself a little to how Jamaica Plain Village was set up in 1775.
So Sarah is invited to stay in the parsonage here, but she actually also gets an invite to stay with a widow on the other side where Elliott Street is now, but there was no Elliott Street. And she stays there with her girls as Reverend Gordon is up the whole night packing. He leaves early the next morning. And she is feeling a lot of grief because she was dropped very quickly by her husband there at the parsonage. And he had to get those carts back because so many other people wanted to get out before the town was closed. So he was gone, she says, within 5 or 6 minutes. And she felt as though she might never see him again. So it was pretty touching. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Jamaica Plain Militia. The next day Sarah is, oh, thank you. Okay. The next day she recounts hearing drums in the morning. As soon as daylight appeared, the drums began to beat, for there had been upward of 50 men lying upon their arms in the meeting house and schoolhouse all the night. Now, the 3rd Company of Roxbury Minutemen came from the Jamaica Plain area, and many were active in the 3rd Parish of Roxbury Church. And I know it's small, you might not be able to read the names there, but there is a roll of company of people that were part of the church that were also active in this militia group. Many of these many of the Jamaica Plain militia actually fought in the Battle of Lexington and Concord under General Heath, and who was also from Jamaica Plain. More on him some other time. I'm going to go on here. So they plan next to go to Dedham, but she needs to find somebody going by with a cart that can take them. She does finally find somebody, a farmer with one horse and a little open cart that can take what is now the 4 of them. There's another young woman who's joined with her and Lucinda and Sally. And Captain Child comes by. He's the captain of the JP militia. And he assists with transportation by telling her that there's a very nice carriage available very close, and he's going to rent it for her. Well, Captain Child also of note is the owner and proprietor of the Peacock Tavern. And you can see on this picture, it's where the Faulkner is now, where Center Street and Allendale Avenue come in now. So it's very close to where the hospital is. And one of the stories that I read about that is that the British soldiers liked to come and frequent the Peacock Tavern after their skating parties at Jamaica Pond. So I thought that was very interesting. I also think that as proprietor, as he's serving beer and victuals to these British soldiers, he's getting a lot of intelligence. So I think he might have been a spy. But anyway, for the Patriots. The letter, I'm stopping here because she's about to leave Jamaica Plain, but the letter goes on. She has many more days of travel and continues through to Rhode Island, through Dedham, Attleboro, and Providence. And finally, she ends up in Canterbury, Connecticut. While she's in Providence, she meets with her former pastor, and why am I forgetting? John Bacon, who was the pastor at Old South for many years. And she says, I don't know where I'm going. I have a place to stay here in Providence, short term, but whoops. And he gives her a letter of introduction to his sister, who lives in his hometown in Canterbury, Connecticut. So that becomes her destination at this point. She lingers a little bit in Providence, hoping to get some information about her husband, but she still has no information about his whereabouts or his welfare. So it's tough. A few of the other people you can read about in the annotation is President Manning of Providence College, later Brown University, John Collins of Newport, who was a member of the Revolution and later in the Continental Congress, and this Elizabeth Goldthwait Cumming, who was John Bacon's wife. And this is from a painting by John Singleton Copley. But I think I'll just end by saying that she does make it to Connecticut. She does not see her husband for the siege of Boston, as you know, lasted some 11 months. And Boston was shut up. People couldn't get in and out usually. And so she didn't see him at least for 11 months. I'm not sure when they did reunite, but they did at some point. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Emily. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So throughout this journey, in the letter, Sarah Deming refers to a woman named Lucinda, one of her frighted girls. The other woman who she refers to traveling with is Sally, who is a niece. And in Sarah's account, Lucinda's never referred to as enslaved or even as a servant, which makes sense. She's writing to her niece who knows Lucinda well. But if you were to read this letter and didn't know the background, you might not realize that Lucinda is an enslaved person. She also doesn't appear as enslaved in other ways that are commonly used today to uncover slavery in New England. She's not in the tax records. She's not in wills. She's not in court records or newspaper ads seeking the return of enslaved people who are seeking their freedom. But Lucinda is there. Her enslavement is hidden in plain sight. And today, despite a great deal of effort in Boston to uncover enslaved people's stories, she's not included in any of the contemporary lists of enslaved people that I've come across in Boston. There's a list that's being compiled, or of those who survived the Middle Passage. She's attended Old South Church. She's not in their records of enslaved people, which makes you wonder how many other people were in this situation. How many other people were enslaved here who we don't know about? So if Lucinda does not appear in all these ways, how do we know about her? So it turns out it's primarily from accounts written by and shared by women, including Sarah Deming, her enslaver, Sarah's relatives, friends, and descendants. We also know about Lucinda from her own handwriting, which is preserved in a book that she owned. And we know more about her life from the writings and testaments of her fellow enslaved and free Black Bostonians who shared her experiences. One of these was the famous poet Phyllis Wheatley, the first African-American author of a published book of poetry, which was published in 1773. Phyllis Wheatley and her life story are quite well known. Many of you are probably familiar with it, but Lucinda's is not. Their lives were strikingly similar in many ways, and they probably knew each other. I'm going to share a few of their similarities. They're both born in West Africa in the mid-1700s, where they lived as children with their parents and in their communities. Both were forcibly taken from their families and trafficked to Boston as very young children. They're only about 6 or 7 years old. Both survived the brutal 2 to 3 month voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage. They were sold in Boston, perhaps even by the same person, and lived a few blocks away from each other with their enslavers. They attended the same church, the Old South Church, which met at the Old South Meeting House. They could read and write, and they both owned books. So today I'm going to share with you a brief outline of Lucinda's story and a little of what we found out about her life. There's a lot more which will be published in a sort of unwieldy article at this point. But I'm going to give you the brief outline tonight. Lucinda was born in West Africa, as I said, and she grew up there as part of a family and larger community in an area of Africa that was remembered by enslaved Bostonians as a populous, pleasant, and plentiful country. As a young child, she was violently separated from her parents, her family, her community, her language, her name. And I hope we can all just take a moment to reflect on the magnitude of this loss. If you can think of a child you know or who you have known who is 6 or 7 years old, and imagine them in this situation. Unfortunately, this was not rare. This was not an exception. We've already heard about Phyllis Wheatley and Lucinda experiencing this. Knowing about Lucinda's life challenges many of the common assumptions that have come down to us, that somehow slavery in New England was gentler or better than slavery in the South. So Lucinda is enslaved in colonial Boston. She would have witnessed suffering and death as a young child, as a survivor of the Middle Passage. On Phyllis Wheatley's trip across through the Middle Passage. 25% of the enslaved people on that voyage died on that route. She's purchased as a slave by John and Sarah Deming, and she lived and worked in their house in Boston. As Natalie was pointing out, this is not uncommon. There were enslaved people living in households throughout Boston and throughout New England. As the only enslaved person in the household so far that we've been able to determine, she would have done a great deal of work, including many of the heaviest and dirtiest of tasks. The Deming household has no children to share in that work, but they include a succession of girls or young women boarders, usually relatives. And one of these boarders, as Natalie mentioned, is Anna Green Winslow, who keeps a wonderful, detailed diary describing her day-to-day life in the Deming household. It's from such an interesting perspective because she's about 12 years old when she's writing this. And she mentions Lucinda on several occasions. She and her aunt have fun and joke a lot. Sometimes she's mending stockings for Lucinda at one point, and we know that Lucinda's probably doing much more difficult work than that. But the household is an economic unit, and everybody is doing their part. So while Anna Green Winslow is living there, she is learning how to read and write and sew and make homespun cloth. And from her and other sources, we know Lucinda was also learning and developed several notable accomplishments. First of all, we know she could play the flute. Anna describes her being the principal piper for a dance, a lively dance for young girls at the Deming household. In Boston at this time, many enslaved people were creative and accomplished musicians, artists, artisans, and writers. Phyllis Wheatley was not the only one. She also could read, which you might be somewhat surprised by, but a high proportion of women and Black people in Boston could read, partly because the congregational churches that they went to really saw it as important to have a relationship with the Bible, be able to read that. And she could write, which was much less common. She had beautiful handwriting. That is actually her handwriting. You can see right there, it says, Lucinda, her book, given by her mistress. She was given this book by Sarah Deming. This was highly unusual. Books were very highly valued. And you can see her handwriting. It's really nice. She probably was learning alongside Anna Green Winslow and other girls who were studying their penmanship. Today, this book is in the collection of the Philadelphia Company, and it's thought to be the only surviving book of the colonial era known to have belonged to an enslaved person. So that's kind of amazing. Meanwhile, Lucinda is living in Boston. She's part of a larger community where people are fighting British rule and Black Bostonians are fighting their enslavement. She would have been well aware of the revolutionary ferment going on all around her in Boston. And the Deming household, as you've heard, was involved with resistance to the British. They were making their own cloth as part of boycotting British goods. Meanwhile, Black people in Boston, both free and enslaved, are fighting against slavery in many ways, including with a succession of petitions to the legislature and lawsuits in the courts. And they begin to point out the irony of white colonists who are fighting for their own freedom from Great Britain while keep enslaving people in their own homes. So we've all probably heard a lot about the beginning of the revolution 250 years ago this month. So I'm not going to go into any detail about that. But By 1775, Boston's occupied by thousands of British troops, and it's increasingly tense. After the war breaks out in Lexington, Lucinda flees Boston with Sarah Deming, and you've heard a bit about their experiences. For the next year, they live as refugees in the homes of friends and relatives, while John Deming stays in British-occupied Boston. And Boston is completely cut off and besieged by the colonial troops. This image is actually a paper cut by Sarah Winslow Deming that shows, I think it's a beautiful paper cut, and it must have taken so long to make. I'm not sure when it was made, but I thought it was interesting also because it shows some of the kinds of conveyances they were using, open carts and closed, much better as a closed cart. The travel they did was so arduous. Finally, the British are driven out of Boston in March of 1776, and Lucinda and Sarah are able to return, but they return to a devastated city. They stay there throughout the war as the fighting moves to other areas, and they work to rebuild Boston. These are very difficult times. Food is scarce, there's frequent food riots, and despite all these challenges, Black people in Massachusetts are continuing to fight to end slavery with petitions through the courts and in other ways. I'm skipping through all this history, which you can read for yourself, but the American Revolution does finally come to an end, but it is a severe economic downturn in Boston. Meanwhile, Sarah Deming is sick and Lucinda's nursing her. Finances in the Deming household are difficult. And through landmark court cases in 1781, brought by Elizabeth Freeman, who you see here, she was from Western Massachusetts, and 1783, they're seen as ending slavery, which is what Mimi was discussing. But the decisions in these cases only freed the litigants. And it's not like anyone was announcing this stuff. So it didn't really end slavery for most people. There were still many enslaved people in Boston and throughout Massachusetts. And Lucinda is one of them. So she gives us insight into nothing changes for Lucinda at this point. And it is not until after years of poor health, Sarah Deming dies in 1788 at the age of 67, that Lucinda is no longer enslaved. But she's in a precarious position. She has few resources or choices of what to do next. She has no family, no property, no home, and no clear way to make a living during a really severe economic downturn. So what she does, she ends up leaving the home of John Deming, and she chooses instead to live with Sarah Deming's nephew, John Winslow, who she knows quite well. He lives in Boston, and his family. And you can see here that she appears on the federal census of 1790 as free, living in John Winslow's household with, I think, 8 other people. And the interesting footnote is that in the 1790 census, Massachusetts recorded no slaves, but this wasn't actually true in practice. There were still many enslaved people in the same position Lucinda had been in just 2 years earlier. If you are living in a household, you're still there and nothing has changed. So she really gives us some insight into how people could live at this time. So from this point forward, she is carving out her life as a free woman. She worked for John Winslow and his family for the rest of her life. She lived with them, and she was said to be a beloved member of the household and was considered very good help in their family. And this information comes from two people who knew Lucinda. Mary Ann Winslow was the daughter of John Winslow. She was born in 1790 and grew up living with Lucinda. And Sally Winslow Coverley, this was the woman who the letter is written to by Sarah Deming. She was John Winslow's sister. Lucinda knew her for decades. She had been a boarder when she was younger in the home. So Lucinda attends church at Old South Church. Just to be confusing, it's the third church in Boston and meets at the Old South Meeting House. So sounds a little like the Jamaica Plain Church. And that congregation at certain points in the colonial period had the highest numbers of Black members of the congregation. So it is something she's very involved with, and she has a whole community there. She sees Sally Winslow Coverley and her growing family regularly. And Sally writes to Anna Green Winslow's mother, who's up in Canada, about Lucinda back in 1795. Now, as far as I can gather, Lucinda probably died sometime between 1804 and 1811. Mary Ann Winslow would have been a teenager when Lucinda died, and she described Lucinda's funeral procession. Lucinda's minister, who was Joseph Eckley, the minister of Old South Church, and this is like one of the powerhouse churches in Boston. He and John Winslow walked next to her hearse as chief mourners in her funeral procession. There were a lot of people there. Mary Ann Winslow remembered it years later and talked about it. The Winslow family and their descendants preserved Lucinda's book and a few other articles that she owned. And there's no gravestone that I could find, but she is probably buried either in King's Chapel burying ground or in the granary with the Winslows, or granary burying ground maybe where the Demings are buried. Lucinda's story really shows how she forged her life from a childhood in Africa, through enslavement in Boston, through war and revolution, and as a free woman in a new nation. So we're preparing an article with so much detail on this that it's just, we're trying to cut it. But this research is really, it's only a starting point. I feel like there's so much to learn about Lucinda and about other enslaved people in Boston. And I hope that some of you will take part in that as well. Thanks so much.
So thank you to both of our presenters, and thanks to our audience for attending. As mentioned previously, we put all of the Hidden Jamaica Plain articles on the JP Historical Society website, and we invite you to join us. Now we'd love to open the floor for comments and questions, and I know that there's a number of people who are online, so why don't we alternate between in-house and online? So I saw a hand here. Okay, I'll try to repeat the question.
In the previous slide, it shows the description, family explanation, and it looks like it says Lucinda was a woman alone or something. Do you know what that says? Woman slave. Explanation. It says woman slave. A woman slave.
Yeah, so this is
Okay, so the question is, why don't you come up and use the mic? The question is that on the photo of the frontispiece of her book, which was written by the Winslow family, there was a question about the wording. So Emily?
Yeah, so this panel is in the book, and successive family members wrote little bits of history. The part that you are looking at says Lucinda was a woman slave belonging to Sarah Winslow, probably after her marriage, day 1741, I think it says. Then other people have written. Another part further down says Lucinda book is in Lucinda's handwriting, and that's signed. And so people shared the story of Lucinda through the generations, and then different people are preserving parts of her story here. So that's what you're looking at. Does that make sense?
Two questions about the book online.
Okay.
So
You
the
wanna
first
repeat
question is, what is the book that this Lucinda had? And the second one is, how did it end up in Philly and not in Boston?
So the first question is, what was the book? And the book was a sermon with a really long name, and it's quite, I'm sorry, I would have to look it up, but yes, it's a sermon, a printed sermon. And what was the second question?
How did it end up in Philadelphia and not in Boston?
That's such a good question. It seems like it ended up in, it was with people who descended through the family. And I'm not sure how it got to Philadelphia, but I know it was in Niagara Falls before that. So I'm not sure how these people moved around.
So another question from this audience.
I think this is just a clarification question, but the letter was written not to the person she traveled with, right? Those are two sides?
Yes.
Yes, the question is, there's all these Sarah Sally people running around, and who's who?
Sally was a common nickname for Sarah. There are actually 3 Sarah Winslows in this story. There's Sarah Winslow Deming. There's Sarah Winslow, her niece, that she writes it to, who becomes Sarah Winslow Coverley. And there's this Sally that she's traveling with, and I have not yet found. She calls her a niece. So I think she's a niece from a second or third cousin, but she calls her Sally Winslow. So I think her name is Sarah Winslow, the third.
So Gretchen, another online?
Not everything else.
Okay, in-house.
I noticed in the beginning they mentioned what you call her a forever servant. I wonder if there was some sort of shame in admitting that you had a slave in the house.
Well, I can answer that, which is the question was there any sense of shame of having an enslaved person in the house in the 1700s?
Yeah.
And the answer is no. This was the system that the colonists adopted to as the chief economic driver of their economy. They didn't have enough people to do the things they wanted to do, and they brought them in any way they could, or they impressed them into service by indenturing them. So there, and this was very common. It was accepted. The question is it wrong? Was it wrong? Was it seen as wrong at the time? And the answer is it began to be. It was, even though 1 in 4 Boston households enslaved someone, it was in right around 1700, one of the ministers in Boston spoke out and began to say, this is not accurate. This is not consistent with being a Christian. And then there were other voices that began to come forward. One of the ones was this Reverend Gordon, who tries to give them the Deming shelter, who runs out of his house and says, welcome, welcome. He, later in 1777, wrote letters to the newspapers saying you should not be advertising enslaved people for sale. So there was some sense that was growing, beginning to grow, that this was not something that was acceptable. And especially after the revolution, the thread that I think Natalie was talking about, where there were people were a little disquieted about the idea, but not everybody. It was still very commonly done, and as we know, people couldn't get out of it, and because of circumstances like Emily was just describing, the situations that and opportunities for people who were enslaved, even if they were able to become free, were pretty dire. There are stories about African women who did become free and were destitute, and they had on Beacon Hill there was a sort of a rooming house, and these women were put to work doing very menial tasks and so on to, quote, earn their living, but not paid anything except for room and board. So it wasn't until a little later that the Black community on the north slope of Beacon Hill developed and became active and started to develop, well, actually it was in the late 1700s, began to develop self-help societies. We've done some research on that too. So, Gretchen, are there any more online? Mhm.
This person wants to know, how often did you all need to gather this information, and for how long have you been working on it?
Well, we've been working for, I guess it's been 3 years now. We meet monthly on Zoom, and we don't really gather too often. We've done a few field trips to historic houses and to see how other people are describing enslaved situations and such. But it's mostly just a Zoom thing, and people go off and do their things. But what's interesting about this is we started off, and because we took the hidden Brookline tour, and we learned about the people who were enslaved in Brookline, and we said to ourselves, well, you know, if it's happening in Brookline, Jamaica Plain's right next door. There were probably enslaved people there too. And that's just a quick survey of that began the hidden Jamaica Plain, because then we went to the Historical Society and said, what should we do? We had some wonderful people who came and from the Historical Society and said that, well, the first thing you have to do is get more people. So we went off and we talked to pretty much all the institutions we could find in JP who were interested and willing. And it turned out a lot of them were doing their own research. Lauren Greeno House, First Church, the Baptist Church, all of them were doing their own research. And we found when we got together that we could share information. And we've had this wonderful cross-fertilization, cross-pollination conversations, and we found that as a group we moved together much faster and much better and much more thoroughly than doing this research on our own. You had a
yes, I wanted to know if Lucinda's book was an autobiography or it was something else.
yeah, the question was Lucinda's book an autobiography?
A recollection of her life.
No, that would have been wonderful, wouldn't it? So the book was one that was given to her by her enslaver, Sarah Winslow Deming. And it was a printed sermon that had been given to Sarah Deming when she was 18 years old. So it was a sermon about, I can't remember exactly, but it was significant as a gift because books were not a common thing to own in Boston at this time. So it was a very significant gift, but no, it wasn't. Phyllis Wheatley wrote a book that was published, and we do know that other enslaved people owned books. They just haven't survived as such. So Phyllis Wheatley owned many books. And she published her own book and had a friend in Providence who she was sending her books to, who was also enslaved. So we know that other enslaved people did own books.
And she was a member of the family. She was not.
Well, so she was in this difficult position because she lives in the household, but she's not really a member of the family. She has some rights in Massachusetts, but she is also treated as property. She could have been sold or hired out at any time. That is how the system worked. It seems, we can see when you read the letter and you look at the parts where Lucinda's in the letter, you'll see that her enslaver, Sarah, treats her with some kindness, I would say. There's a point at which it's pouring rain outside and they have a carriage, but Lucinda, as the only enslaved person, is expected to ride outside that cart in the really horrible weather. And Sarah Deming says, we can't do this. So they wait and they go in two groups so that Lucinda can also ride inside. So there's some, you can imagine that there were some feelings of connection there, but she's not really a part of the family.
Yeah, I think one other interesting point on that is in the letter, there's a point at which Sarah, I think they were in Providence at that point, and Sarah Deming is saying, I don't know whether we can go on like this. I don't know whether I can keep everybody together. I think I can get Sally, my niece, to go to somebody's house, that she knows a few people, and I may have to hire out Lucinda. So that was fairly common, that if you had an enslaved person, you could put them out to hire and get money for their labor power. Go ahead, please. A question in the room? Yeah.
So, given the fact that Lucinda is not on any tax records, she didn't seem to be any sale like that, proving that of enslavement. What would have stopped her from, given the time, 1700s, what would have stopped her from just walking away if she found say a male friend, a free black person in Boston, wanted to help her? Could she have just walked away?
So the question is, could Lucinda have just walked away from the Demings household at any point?
There's no bill of sale.
Because there's no bill of sale. Well, first off, we don't know whether there's a bill of sale. There might have been. We do not know that. We have been unable to find that. Secondly, there probably wasn't any problem with walking away, except for they would come after you. And we see lots of runaway ads in the newspapers from that time, looking for people who've self-liberated. If she might have been able to find a free black man to marry her, that might have changed her condition, but certainly not before 1783, pretty much. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, what you described is something that a lot of enslaved people did do, but there's thousands of ads, looking for the return of people who had left their enslavement. I think it was a lot less common for women to do that. And also, Lucinda's been enslaved since she was 6 years old. So it's a, and she does not have any family or other people she could rely on to get her out of there. It's interesting because Phyllis Wheatley ends up getting, as some of you may know, she's freed after she publishes her book in 1773, and she does end up marrying a free Black man, John Peters, and she is then trying to support herself, and he's trying to support himself, and it's a very difficult time in Boston. But yes, so there's other people, there's a good sized free community as well in Boston, but sometimes people had been kidnapped and sent to south to be enslaved again. So there's a lot of peril in that situation, I guess. Yeah, right.
Free Black person being kidnapped and taken down.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly.
Well, and I think, well, this will be our last question.
I might have mentioned this, but if someone would repeat where Lucinda and Sarah are buried.
The question is, where were Lucinda and Sarah buried?
The answer is we don't know, but the Winslows are buried in King's Chapel burying ground, and John Deming is buried in Granary burying ground. And I'm not sure if Sarah Deming's where she's buried, actually, but we could find nothing for Lucinda.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. We're available for